This is just a brief overview of the period of Jackson's presidency. And what I want to do here is give you really a look at the three major events that are often associated with President Andrew Jackson and his time in the White House, and also to make a broader connection as to why these three events are relevant still today in many different ways. And probably the most common event that President Andrew Jackson is associated with today is what's commonly referred to as the Trail of Tears, even though that particular incident itself occurred after his presidency was over. But really, what we're talking about here is a period of Indian or Native American removal from what at the time was the American Southeast, states like Florida, Georgia, it's going to be Alabama, Mississippi, moving those tribes and bands west of the Mississippi River. Now, what's driving all of this and sort of the reason behind the desire for Americans to move into this territory is an unprecedented demand for cotton. Places like New England and especially England itself are industrializing. And as a result of industrialization, there's a massive demand for raw materials like cotton because textiles, that is clothing for the first time, are being mass produced. Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin also at the end of the 18th century made it much, much easier to produce cotton. And so, all at this point, the Americans need in the South is access to more land to essentially print more money in the form of cotton, which, of course, we're using enslaved people to produce. But the reality is the drive behind the Indian removal is driven by economic concerns to try to get more land, to grow more cotton and sell more of it. Now, Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe beforehand argued that Indian tribes in the Southeast should exchange their lands for lands west of the Mississippi, but they never made any steps to make it happen. As a result, what ends up happening under Jackson's presidency is a turn towards coercion, towards trying to get these tribes to move west of the Mississippi. And I should point out here, Jackson is known for a couple of things early on in his life, most notably the Battle of New Orleans, but he's also known as somebody who fought against different Native American tribes at different times. He is sort of the quintessential Indian fighter in the early 19th century. He is not a supporter of Native American rights or tribes in any way, shape, or form. And right away in his presidency, tries to persuade Congress to pass different laws to get Native American tribes to move west of the Mississippi River. Now, from a legal standpoint, to be clear, the United States Constitution empowered Congress, quote, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes, end quote. So in early treaties that are negotiated between the federal government and a lot of these Indian tribes and bands, many of these tribes acknowledge themselves to be sort of under the protection of the United States and give up their sovereignty. And this idea of surrendering sovereignty is what Andrew Jackson's really going to use as the impetus for trying to get these tribes to give up their land. So, to achieve all of this, Jackson encourages Congress to pass an Indian Removal Act. They do. It's called the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The act establishes a process whereby the president can just grant lands west of the Mississippi River to different tribes who are willing to give up their land. Now, willing should be in air quotes because the governments, state and federal, are going to use all kinds of bribes in order to try to get Native American leaders to give up these different lands, or they're going to use all kind of coercive tactics and everything that they can to make it happen. But in the end, the vast majority of tribal individuals who do live in the Southeast choose, and again, that's in air quotes, to relocate. In the end, one tribe doesn't, and that's the Cherokee Nation that currently existed in Georgia. The Cherokee Nation decides to take a different pact. What they're going to do instead of trying to negotiate with the government is they sue the federal government. And it gets all the way to the Supreme Court, and they argue that they have a treaty in existing, which they did, with the federal government that gave them a guarantee on their land, and that therefore the federal government couldn't change the terms of that contract afterwards. And Chief Justice John Marshall actually sides with the Cherokee. He decides that they are correct, that they do have a right to their land, and that the federal government cannot force them in any way off. However, President Jackson chooses not to follow the Supreme Court decision. Yes, this has happened in American history where a president has declined to support the Supreme Court, because while the Supreme Court can issue a decision, it doesn't have an army and it has no ability to enforce its decision. So Andrew Jackson decides that he isn't going to do so. Now, this issue sort of kicks around for a long time, because the Trail of Tears doesn't really start until late 1830s, 1838, by which time Andrew Jackson is not the president any longer. And that's because it gets tied up in Congress. There's issues with the election of 1832 that come in here. But at the end of the day, the Cherokee tribe is eventually forced all the way from what was Georgia to what is today Oklahoma. And we do believe that there's about 15 to 16,000 total people are forced to make the trek, out of which about 3 to 4,000 of whom die on the trail. It's one of these instances that's sort of like a national black eye. Now, this is all still relevant today, of course, because there are still Native American tribes in the United States today residing on different reservations, and there's still attempts to test and probe the extent to which that sovereignty should exist. Most notably, there's been recent cases about whether or not pipelines could go through Native American lands if those Native American tribes do not want it at a given time. And so this is still an issue that comes up today. Now, the second thing that Andrew Jackson is known for is what's called euphemistically as the Bank War. So after the War of 1812 is over, we don't have a national bank. You might remember that Alexander Hamilton convinced Congress to pass a national bank, which they did, but its charter expired before the War of 1812. After the War of 1812, a lot of Americans look around and think that one of the reasons that they weren't more able to fight the British is because they couldn't subsidize the cost of their armies effectively without a national bank. And so after the War of 1812, the second national bank comes into being. Now, Andrew Jackson hates banks and despises the national bank, and he's not alone there. A lot of people, Andrew Jackson included, don't really understand the bank. They don't really know what it does. It's different from, say, farming. You plant a crop, it grows, you sell that crop, you get the money in exchange. From their perspective, and I'm talking about Andrew Jackson and the Democrats who supported him primarily, banks look like something that just has to be some sort of form of corruption. Like money goes into it and somehow more money comes out. They don't really understand it, and they're very distrustful of the bank. So what happens is this. The bank is up for recharter in the mid 1830s. Henry Clay, who was Andrew Jackson, one of his opponents in the election of 1824, decides he's going to run against Andrew Jackson in 1832. And what he decides to do is he's going to make the bank the issue. And the way he's going to do that is he's going to convince the chairman of the bank to request an early recharter. Clay does this because he knows that Jackson is going to respond negatively, and that will allow Clay to turn the election of 1832 into a referendum on the bank, and he thinks he can win on that issue. The problem is he can't, and he loses the election of 1832, and as a result, now Andrew Jackson is in the perfect position to go ahead and make the death blow to this bank that he hates so much. He's not going to renew the charter. Everybody knows that, and is ready to veto any attempt that comes out of Congress to renew the charter. But that's not fast enough for him. What Andrew Jackson does instead is he orders all the federal deposits that have been made in the national bank to be withdrawn. He's essentially taking all the money out of the bank, which means it can't issue loans, it can't repay its debts, it cannot conduct its business. So he's trying to kill the bank by taking away the deposits. This plan kind of backfires on him. The commissioner tries to instead reissue the bank's charter, calling it just the Bank of Philadelphia and the Bank of Pennsylvania alternatively. And what happens is what Andrew Jackson doesn't understand, and what a lot of people don't understand, is that the bank was actually being run fairly effectively. And when the Bank of the United States goes away, all of these local banks crop up almost overnight. But the local banks aren't as good at making loans and it's not as intelligent in carrying out their businesses. So they issue a whole bunch of loans after the bank expires in 1836. Those loans almost immediately go bad in many cases. A lot of the banks file for bankruptcy, they can't pay their debts. And what you have is what's referred to as the Panic of 1837. We have a lot of these in the 19th century. They're called panics. We call them recessions or depressions today. Back then, they called them panics. So, because all the banking system collapses, uh, the nation is thrown into a panic or a recession. So the end of the bank has bad consequences. However, Andrew Jackson's term of office ended in 1836, and so he is not left holding the bag. The last event is what's referred to as the Nullification Crisis. I want you to think of this as like the dress rehearsal for the Civil War. That's going to come down the pipeline about 30 years later on. The Nullification Crisis has its roots in something I discussed in a previous lecture, and that's the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions back in 1798 and 1799. Those were written by Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson postulated the theory that a state could nullify a law that's issued by the federal government if it doesn't like it. In other words, a state doesn't have to follow the laws of the United States unless, and I'm still unclear as to where they came up with this idea, unless that is ratified by 3/4 of the states in the Union. Again, the sort of 3/4 part is a little bit murky, but that's the idea. So what kicks this all off is the idea of a tariff. Congress passes a tariff in 1828. A tariff is a tax on imports. So something that comes in from another country. So you put a tax on it and you have to pay more for it as a consumer. The purpose behind a tariff is usually to try to protect home industry. If you make a lot of rocking chairs, you don't want a whole bunch of rocking chairs from England or whatever to come in at lower prices and destroy your rocking chair industry in the United States. So you slap a tariff on it that raises the price of the British rocking chairs and makes it more likely, in theory, that people will buy your rocking chairs. Unfortunately, what this also does is it increases the cost of a lot of goods. And in this case, Southerners hated the tariff. They called it the tariff of abominations. And the reason they hated the tariff was pretty simple. The South was engaged in exporting. They basically have one. They have one economic export at this point. It's cotton. That's all they do. They make cotton and they export it to the northeast of the United States and a lot of it to Great Britain, where it's turned into textiles. And the issue is when the tariff is placed on British textiles coming over from England, the British decide they're going to pass that cost along to the Southerners who are producing the cotton. So, in other words, in order to maintain their profit margins, they're not going to pay as much for the cotton as they would have otherwise because they can't sell their textiles for as much. Moreover, Southerners, because they don't have a lot of industry in the South, they import, a lot of finished goods from places like Great Britain. Even things that aren't textiles, things like furniture, luxury goods, other of those sorts of things. Things that in some cases are not produced in the United States yet. Because a lot of the wealthy families in the South have a lot of money and they want to spend that money. But now these tariffs make it a lot more expensive for them to live the lifestyle that they would have otherwise enjoyed living. So what happens is, at the time, Andrew Jackson's vice president is a guy by the name of John C. Calhoun. His picture is up there on the slide. He is from South Carolina. He resigns as vice president as a result of all of this and returns to South Carolina, where he is basically immediately reelected as one of the two senators from South Carolina. South Carolina then holds a convention, and in the convention, they vote to nullify the Tariff of Abominations. They're not going to follow it, and they again declare that, well, three-quarters of the current existing states haven't passed this, so we're not going to go with it either. This then forces another issue, because what ends up happening is South Carolina decides that it's going to take it one step further. They're going to potentially secede from the Union, which means they're going to leave the Union if they don't get their way. This is exactly what's going to happen in 1860, about 30 years later. We could have fought the Civil War in 1830, 1832. We just didn't. And in a lot of ways, what's going to be the Confederacy probably would have stood a better chance had the Civil War been fought in 1830 and not in 1860, but that's not the way history worked out. So there's this showdown now where South Carolina is threatening to secede from the Union, but then they run into a snag because they send commissioners out to other states. And unlike in 1860, in 1832, no other states are willing to stand with South Carolina on this one. No other states, not Georgia, North Carolina, Alabama, none of these states are willing to leave the Union. So South Carolina's kind of left standing alone. At the same time, back in Washington, Andrew Jackson is absolutely furious. Andrew Jackson, by the way, has famous temper. He is absolutely furious. He is ready to march an army down to South Carolina, and he gets Congress to pass a force bill, which says that he's allowed to take troops down to any state that's not complying with a federal law and make them do it. Ultimately, what ends up happening is Congress passes a new tariff. Congress passes a new tariff in 1832, which splits the baby a little bit. It gives some relief from the tariff. It's not quite as burdensome. And as a result, it gives South Carolina and John C. Calhoun a way to sort of back down and save face. So in the end, what they're able to do is nothing happens as a result. No troops are marched to South Carolina. It's a dry run, though, of the Civil War, because we're going to see the exact same scenario play out after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. But that's a little bit in the future at this point. These issues are still with us today because, of course, this is nothing more than federalism. This is just who gets more power in our system, the states or the federal government. Andrew Jackson firmly believed that the federal government should have the say. John C. Calhoun and many like him believe that the states should have more power in our system. And we still see this issue playing out over and over again on everything from gun rights to voting legislations to reproductive rights, all the way down the line. The question always comes up, who gets the say over these issues? And so this is kind of a problem that's been going on for a long time in the United States. And in most cases, the states and the federal government have been able to work it out, with one notable exception. But in 1832, they were able to resolve the crisis, and we did not have a civil war.